Captured without a shot being fired. The boss of Mexico's violent Zetas drug cartel is taken down by Marines. It's the first big arrest for President Enrique Peña Nieto. But can he win Mexico's drug war and win friends in Washington? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. He has a reputation for extreme violence and brutality. Miguel Angel Trevino Morales, the leader of Mexico's feared Zetas drug cartel, now in custody after he was caught by Mexican Marines close to the border with the United States. Trevino Morales is wanted by Mexico and the US, accused of murder, torture, organized crime and drug trafficking. He's blamed for the shipment of hundreds of kilos of cocaine and marijuana each week from Mexico to the US, and moving bulk shipments of dollars back into Mexico. It prompted the US to issue a $5 million reward for information leading to his arrest, underlining its shared priorities with Mexico. To our panel in a moment. First, Rachel Levine has this report from Mexico City.
One of Mexico's most wanted and feared criminals was captured alive on Monday by Mexican security forces.
No se llevó a cabo ni un solo disparo.
At 3:45 in the morning, a helicopter from the Marines detected a pickup truck with 3 people inside. They detained and arrested them.
Miguel Angel Trevino Morales is leader of the Zetas, one of Mexico's most violent drug cartels. He was arrested near Nuevo Laredo, the cartel's stronghold, which is just 100 kilometers from the U.S. border. Trevino is the most important cartel leader to be apprehended in years. His capture marks the biggest victory yet for President Enrique Peña Nieto, who campaigned on a promise to bring down violence. Since taking office last December, homicide rates have not dropped, but Trevino's capture will most likely boost confidence for the president, both at home and abroad. The Zeta leader was known for his vicious tactics, including decapitations and hangings. He ordered the mass killing of 72 migrants in northern Mexico in 2010. Trevino took control of the cartel after the original founder, Heriberto Lascano, was killed by the Marines last year. Trevino is wanted both here in Mexico and the United States, and it's uncertain whether or not he'll be extradited. But one thing looks more than likely to occur, and that's that Mexico could see a spike in violence in the weeks and months ahead as rival gangs fight for Zeta territory. Rachel Levine, Al Jazeera, Mexico City.
Well, let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., Christopher Wilson, associate at the Mexico Institute, specializing in U.S.-Mexico border affairs. In Mexico City, Andres Layuz, a journalist for Nexos magazine, who's been covering Mexico's war on drugs. Also in our Washington News Center, Juan Carlos Hidalgo, a policy analyst on Latin America at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Andres Layuz. On the face of it, a massive setback to the drug dealers. Is it really?
It's probably not a setback, but it's nevertheless important that Trevino Morales was arrested. He was particularly violent, and the Zetas cartel is actually an umbrella organization for various smaller cells of the Zetas. So the arrest of Trevino, it does deliver a blow to this umbrella organization. However, it shouldn't be unexpected that there could be more violence related to a power vacuum within the Zetas. I think it's an important blow in the sense that this person had to be arrested. He's particularly violent. He's famous for massacring hundreds of people. So in that sense, it's good news.
Well, Christopher Wilson in Washington, D.C., what are we going to see now? A breakdown of the cartel into smaller bits, a turf war, as we heard there?
I think that's a likely scenario in the sort of short to medium term. There's generally, after a major kingpin or capo is taken down, there's some sort of struggling both within the organization to take control and also struggling by other groups trying to move in on some of that original group's terrain, take over some of their business. But on the other hand, this is the probably one of the most violent members of one of the most violent criminal groups in Mexico. So taking him out of the picture, which also comes on the heels of other arrests and killings of other leaders of the Zetas over the last couple of years, is really a slow dismantling of that criminal organization that's continuing. And that's important because there's a new government in Mexico right now. So this means that we're continuing that policy of taking apart this particular organization, which really in the long run will mean less violence for Mexico.
Well, Juan Carlos Hidalgo, we'll get back to that point about the new government in Mexico, but just on that issue of dismantling the cartels, it does appear that the policy has been largely to take it from the top down. If you take off the head, the snake dies, but that snake has stayed very much alive despite the fact that so many leaders have been killed or arrested.
Indeed, a leaked document from the government of the United States look at what happens after this decapitation strategy, if it has any effect on the flow of drugs into the United States. This is a document from the very own U.S. government, and they found that there is no discernible pattern whatsoever between the decapitation, either the arrest or the killing of a major drug lord in Mexico, and either an increase or a decrease in the flow of drugs into the United States. So certainly the arrest of Treviño won't have any effect on the flow of drugs into the United States. It might create a spike of violence in Mexico, though, and we will see in the future months how what happens to the Zetas, this umbrella organization, as the previous guest explained, and what happens to the turf wars between the Zetas and other important cartels, such as the Sinaloa cartel that has been fighting with the Zetas for several years.
Well, linked to this, of course, is, as we mentioned, the policy of a government and of a president who's only been in office for the past year. Andres Layou, the issue is basically, is the president of Mexico interested in cutting down on violence in Mexico as a priority, or stopping the flow of drugs into the United States as a priority? What should be and what is his first determinant at the moment?
Rhetorically, this government has insisted that their main objective is the reduction of violence. And they've tried to set out some plans that they argue is for the prevention of violence. However, we've seen the continuation of the policy of the previous government, and I think that the arrest of Treviño Morales is part of that continuation, because it's still focused on the kingpins. However, there's been a change, and that's very important, on the communication of the drug war from the government. And that means that violence is less covered in the media than it should be and that it was in the past, but still the homicide rate hasn't really changed. The patterns we see in homicides, particularly regionally, are basically the same as in the last few years. So we're still waiting for the rhetoric of the government to actually become policy. And it's already been 6 months and we haven't seen much of it.
Well, Juan Carlos Hidalgo, I see that you're nodding in agreement. Do you want to add something to that?
Indeed, we have seen a change in narrative from the previous administration of Felipe Calderón. The Enrique Peña Nieto, the new president of Mexico, he wants to focus his presidency on economic reform. He doesn't talk about violence, but if we look at the ground, we looked at the crime rates, we see that murders continue unabated in Mexico. I was reading an article precisely in Nexus magazine that shows that in the first semester of the year, at least 5,000 people have been killed in episodes of drug violence. Now, these numbers are not very credible. Alejandro Hope, one of the most important analysts in Mexico, has pointed out various discrepancies in the numbers of killings, in official numbers of killings in Mexico. So I agree with my colleague that rhetorically the administration talks about change, but in the ground things are pretty much the same.
Well, Christopher Wilson, your view on this, is it an issue of communication, of rhetoric, of giving different words to the same old message?
Well, I think, we're slowly learning more and more about what the government strategy really is. We've heard from the beginning that it's a strategy focused on violence reduction, and I don't think that's just rhetoric. I mean, that's also simply what the Mexican people are demanding. Anywhere in Mexico, public security is an issue at a certain level, and it's an important issue for people, and they demand that their government lowers it. So the government's trying their best to respond to that. But there are many strategies that you can take. You can try to confront and destroy criminal organizations. You can try to build up social infrastructure to prevent crime. You could use a targeted approach where you try to take out only the most violent organization in order to convince others to be less violent. There are lots of strategies, and we're not exactly sure which sort of selection from all the menu is being utilized. But now we're learning a little more with this arrest that the kingpin strategy continues as at least one piece of the overall public security strategy. So as we talk more about public security and social prevention of crime, we're still seeing, on the other hand, the security forces, the Marines, going after cartel leaders, trying to dismantle the organizations, or at least the very most violent organizations, which is what the Zetas are. The Zetas are sort of a particular case where it really makes more sense to go after the top level of the Zetas than it probably does to go after the top level of every group. Because taking out this particularly violent group could leave a more stable situation in the long run.
Well, let's just pause for a moment and take a closer look at the man now in custody. Miguel Angel Trevino Morales began running errands for his local gang as a teenager, quickly graduating to cross-border drug running. As part of the Gulf cartel, he helped push for the breakaway of the Zetas drug gang, eventually taking over as head of that cartel last year, when Marines shot dead the former commander. And although he lacked any military background, he gained notoriety for his brutality. And here's why.
This person has 7 arrest orders by federal judges and is involved in at least 12 previous cases. He is accused of organized crime, homicides, crimes against health, torture, money laundering, importing firearms normally used exclusively by armed forces, among others.
And Trevino's ruthless reputation only added to that of the Zetas cartel, considered one of the most powerful in Mexico. It was formed by soldiers who defected from the military's special forces in the late 1990s to work as hitmen and bodyguards for the Gulf cartel. They later split to form their own group, sparking a violent turf war in northern Mexico. And as the Zetas spread across the country, so too did their business interests, from drug smuggling to extortion and human trafficking. The group is blamed for some of the drug war's worst acts of violence, including hangings, beheadings, and mass killings. The group, though, has grown throughout the war on drugs that we've been talking about, declared by the previous president. But according to some statistics, as many as 70,000 people have been killed in drug-related violence since 2006, 22,000 in the past 2 years alone. So we go back to the question, Juan Carlos Hidalgo. Is this war on drugs actually being won when you look at that type of statistic?
Well, it depends on what the measurement you use to talk about winning or losing the war on drugs. We never hear from those who support this policy what's the end goal of it. If you look at drug consumption rates in the United States, which is, I think, the ultimate measurement of whether this is working or not, we see the very own numbers and figures from the U.S. government, and they agree that consumption rates are going up, not down. The only drug where consumption rates is going down is cocaine, but that has more to do with a change in taste and a change in attitudes of Americans towards that drug than enforcement alone. If you look at marijuana, methamphetamines, heroin, and so on, it's pretty clear that consumption rates are going up, and that shows that these efforts by the United States and other countries in the hemisphere aren't working. But on the other hand, we have Mexico, we have especially Central America and other countries in that cocaine route from the Andes to the United States becoming some of the countries most dangerous in the world. Actually, 7 out of the 8 most dangerous countries in the world are those countries in the cocaine route from the Andes to the United States. So that's a clear indication that the strategy isn't working.
Well, Christopher Wilson, this brings us to the question, One is attempting to stop the smuggling of drugs, but it does appear that it is largely looking at source, in this particular case, the cartels in Mexico, and not enough attention perhaps being paid to consumption, which is a United States responsibility within its own borders. Is there a confusion here about how to actually address the issue, to look at the consumption part of it rather than the production?
I think there's two issues going on here. One is the drug trafficking, which is one of the factors fueling violence in Mexico and other countries in Latin America. And in that case, absolutely, the United States has to take very seriously its responsibility to try to lower consumption and or find ways to minimize the damage done by the consumption of drugs in the United States. It's a huge issue, and it's one that can't be ignored. It's one that's had some attention put on it, but needs much more attention inside the United States. But I really think it's important to also think of what are really the factors driving violence, and what is really the issue, first of all, in Mexico. And the issue is public security and violence. It's not stopping drug trafficking. That's the issue that Mexicans want addressed by their government, and they've demanded that their government address. And to do that, you can't simply cut out the drug trafficking. If demand were to end today, violence in Mexico would not end tomorrow. There are many other factors. The Zetas are known to be trafficking migrants, to be extorting businesses, to be running illegal trade of all sorts, not just drugs. And those are all important factors driving their profits and causing them to be extremely violent. The drug trade is only one piece of their criminal portfolio. And we need to focus on the underlying factors, which are really the institutions of the rule of law in Mexico, building up of stronger courts, of stronger police, less corrupt and more accountable officials throughout the government. So it's a much more comprehensive, bigger issue than simply looking at drug trafficking as the cause of this violence.
Well, Andre Leyu, let's also take a look at the context of governance here. The issue, we have had a new president come in. He appears initially to have adopted the point of view that Mexico is not the US lackeys in this, that Mexico has its own sovereign rights. It will exercise as it sees fit in terms of dealing with issues like drug trafficking and general violence. Is this mere rhetoric, as we mentioned, or is there a difference in this administration that does sincerely want to try and root out the societal problems within the country itself, rather than focusing on a product of those societal problems, which is drug trafficking?
I think it's not only rhetoric in the sense that it appears that the government has learned from the past administration. There's some trial and error going on. However, it's very hard to implement a change in policy. The whole security forces and the relationship, particularly the relationship with US security forces, is based on the cutting down kingpin strategy. So there's a lot of things that have to change. For example, police training has to be completely different. The sources of intelligence and information for police work has to be more local, and right now it's still mainly centralized. So I think that even if the objectives have changed because of past experience, it's really hard to implement, and they offered results really fast, and I don't think they will be able to achieve those results as fast as they thought they would. That's one thing. The other thing is that I disagree with Christopher. I think that the whole context that the drug war brings to Mexico is what fuels other types of violence. Criminal organizations have a permanent inflow of tons of money with which they buy tons of weapons from the US. And with that, they build logistical organizations that are able to construct extortion rackets and human trafficking, etc. So probably the context would be completely different, even if you had other types of crimes, if we didn't have the context of the drug war. And by that, I not only mean the money and the weapons, but the strategy is thought of as a strategy still designed by the DEA in the US to fight off drugs and not to fight off violence. And I think that would make a big difference.
Well, I want to bring in Juan Carlos Hidalgo on this particular point. Only last week, the head of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, Michelle Leonhardt, was actually in Mexico holding a meeting with the president. A few days later, you have this very significant arrest, raising questions about whether intelligence about this type of arrest is coming from the US or whether it is local Mexican intelligence or a mixture of both. But the question simply is to what degree does Mexico need to go it alone to actually change societally the nation as a whole rather than use US influence or help to do so?
Well, it's pretty. It looks like definitely the Mexican authorities rely on U.S. intelligence to capture Miguel Treviño. We're not sure for a fact, but it looks like this is the case, as it's been in previous cases. I disagree enormously with Chris in the sense that saying that drugs are a minor component or just one more component of the crime that is affecting Mexico right now. There was a study by the RAND Corporation a few years ago that tried to discern what percentages of the incomes of the revenues of the organized crime cartels in Mexico derive from drugs or what comes from other crimes, and they looked at overwhelmingly. Over 80% of the revenues of cartels come from the drug business. This is what gives them billions of dollars. According to the Department of Justice, at least $39 billion a year is the estimated revenue of Mexican and Colombian cartels. So I don't think that it makes any help to this debate trying to diminish the impact that drug trafficking has in giving lots of money and lots of power to transnational crime organizations in Mexico. And from this power is that they are challenging the state authority in Mexico and wreaking havoc in Mexican society and institutions.
Well, Christopher Wilson, that this raises the issue of it is a massive economy. It is something on which the Mexican economy is largely based at this particular time.
I think there are other studies, another RAND study actually, that suggests that the numbers that we hear from the UN and from the US intelligence estimates may be inflated. Maybe we're talking about $6 billion rather than something around $40 billion. It's very hard to know, obviously. This is an illegal trade. It's all in the black market. But nonetheless, that's a lot of money. That can buy a lot of weapons. That's a lot of firepower that's attached to that. And it certainly is one of the factors that's played into this, this public security crisis that's developed in parts of Mexico. I think the point that I was trying to make is that the Zetas in particular, in contrast to some of the other more traditional drug trafficking organizations, have a more diverse criminal portfolio and probably get a smaller share of their profits from the drug trade. Of course, those are issues, but I really want to get back to the point that I think we oftentimes overestimate the influence of the United States in setting the policy in Mexico. Mexico, absolutely, we've seen since the coming in of the new administration, is calling the shots, is developing its own strategy, and it has the power to say to the United States, we'd like support in this, this, and this. And the United States, frankly, is going to respond and say, we'll be happy to offer support in this, this, and this, because if the United States' interest, one, yes, to stop drugs, but also very much to have a safer, more stable country as its next door neighbor, a place that it can do business with, because really legal trade, trade in autos, in machinery, in grains, etc., is a much bigger industry than the illicit drug trafficking.
Well, very quickly, a last word from you on that particular issue, Andres Lajou. The issue that the United States needs Mexico, Mexico needs the United States. Is this form of cooperation a way to truly transform Mexican society?
I think there needs to be a lot of cooperation, and probably that's linked also to other issues like immigration policy and things like that. However, we still have to wait and see what the government will be able to do, the Mexican government will be able to do on its own regarding the gathering of information and intelligence. Because the problem is not that the US directly, or the US government is directly thinking on how to intervene in Mexico, but that the Mexican authorities rely heavily on intelligence from the DEA. And the intelligence from the DEA is based on DEA objectives. So for example, the DEA has to justify its own resources to the US Congress. So they have to show that they're working. And normally they show that they're working by showing us photos of big drug busts, etc. So we need to see how the government breaks off certain parts of the relationship that really are not a relationship between equals, but more a dependency of the Mexican security forces on the information given by the DEA.
Well, at that particular point, thank you to my guests, Christopher Wilson, Andres Layou, and Juan Carlos Hidalgo. Don't forget you can find this show and many more at aljazeera.com. Just follow the link for the shows. And also at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And why not leave us your comments there too. Thanks for watching. From me, Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.